As they campaign for the White House, Vice President Kamala Harris and Governor Tim Walz have one very clear message. They say they're about unity, an end to the hate and division sown by former President Donald Trump and his MAGA acolytes. And while personally I do believe Donald Trump is the most divisive, most dangerous president the US has had in my lifetime, I can't help but ask, will another Trump loss really put an end to all that division? I'm not just talking about Trump's hateful rhetoric and incendiary language. I'm talking about all the right-wing violence that he's inspired and that, frankly, has only continued and escalated since he was last booted from the White House. Yes, in the aftermath of January the 6th, the Anti-Defamation League reported 40 right-wing terror incidents between 2020 and 2022, an almost 50% increase from the previous 2 years. And just last year, a full one-third of Republicans said that violence may be the answer to saving the United States. This, of course, comes as US officials have faced a surge in violent threats. According to the New York Times, quote, last year more than 450 federal judges were targeted with threats, a roughly 150% increase from 2019. That was on top of the over 8,000 threats sent to members of Congress last year, up by more than 50% from 2018. Yes, unfortunately, as the election approaches and this type of violence continues to trend upwards, the idea of a quote-unquote civil war in the US feels less and less just like a good idea for an Alex Garland movie, but more and more like a real looming threat, something that in many ways already showed its beginnings on January the 6th. In fact, some say that this has all been a long time coming. Jack Goldstone, an expert on unrest and political instability, practically predicted January the 6th and all we would see after, writing alongside Peter Turchin, less than 2 months before the 2020 election, quote, is the US likely headed for still greater protests and violence? In a word, yes. Today, we're 4 years out from the culmination of Goldstone and Turchin's alarmingly accurate predictions. So what do they think will happen next? Is the US still heading towards maybe, God forbid, a civil war? Let's ask one of them. Joining me now is Jack Goldstone, Professor of Public Policy at George Mason University, an expert on civil unrest. Also joining me now is NYU history professor, fascism expert, Mussolini expert, Ruth Ben-Ghiat. Ruth is also the author of Strongmen, Mussolini to the Present, which breaks down the authoritarian playbook and how to stop it. Ruth, Jack, thank you so much for joining me on Mehdi Unfiltered. Jack, let me start with you. You had sadly, a pretty good track record when it comes to kind of documenting, predicting, warning about some of this stuff. So what are your worries and predictions and concerns right now as we head into the November election?
Well, Mehdi, thank you for having me. I'm sorry to say my worries have not gone away. It seems the unfettered rhetoric of hatred and anger is continuing. But more than Donald Trump, as you say, it's bigger than one person. What we've seen are two major problems. One is that trust in American institutions has broken down. And this is true across the political spectrum. If we look at polling that says, do you have faith in the American judiciary, in Congress, the numbers are in the 20 to 30% range. So if people don't trust institutions, if they don't trust government, they're vulnerable to invocations to try and do something else. Now, America has always had a violent streak.
Yep.
We're a well-armed nation. We have a cowboy tradition. Yes. And whether it was Waco or Oklahoma federal bombing, there have always been small incidents, small groups and individuals who have felt violence is necessary. What's now alarming is that you have a major political party that is saying violence may be necessary. And what's more, even those who have committed some of the most terrible acts of violence against our government should be praised. The January 6th rioters, imagine if instead of 5,000 there had been 10,000. Imagine if they'd simply held the Capitol overnight and then there were sympathetic similar actions in 2 or 3 state capitals. President Trump could have called out the National Guard, had it suppressed the proceedings, or maybe insisted that Congress take over the determination of the presidency.
And that would be a form of civil strife. I mean, when we think about civil war, we think in this kind of, we think of 2 armies on a battlefield in 1865. That's not necessarily what a civil conflict in the US would look like now.
No, what it would mean is an end to the lawful processes that we believe in. Now, revolutions have changed. They're more peaceful than they used to be. And we could have civil strife that changes our institutions, that's a different kind of conflict than our old 19th century Civil War, but that still pits 2 groups of Americans against each other.
Ruth, you and I have been talking about Donald Trump, sadly, for about 9 years now. In the run-up to the 2016 election, we were concerned because he was telling protests to He was telling people in his crowds to punch protesters. I'll pay for your bail. I'll pay to get you out of prison. That was his violent rhetoric back then. By 2020, as we know, the big lie, fight like hell, the mob at the Capitol. And now 2024, it's I'm going to be dictator for a day, because apparently dictators are only dictators for a day, and I'm going to do a bloody mass deportation of foreigners, is what he said at the weekend, of undocumented immigrants. It gets worse with every election cycle. At what point does it's just too late to stop this stuff?
I think it's never too late to stop it, but it is. I'm glad you went over this history, because one of the big trends is that Donald Trump has relentlessly been trying to change Americans' perceptions of violence. He's been doing this using his rallies since 2015 as opportunities to make Americans see violence as in a positive light, as necessary, as the way to solve differences with people who don't agree with him or with MAGA. And also, ultimately, we saw on January 6th, violence is the way you change history. And that goes back to fascism. Yeah, it's also part of communism, but it goes back to fascism. This is what demagogues do. They have to condition people to see violence differently. And so I also link in here his ceaseless dehumanization of undocumented workers,
Yes.
And other targets, because what he's doing here is he's preparing people in the fascist tradition to not be so bothered or believe that it's necessary to accept whatever violence would come if he comes back to the White House, because that's how you shift a whole civil society. And of course, he has many, many partners. And I've been tracking the times, like I'll just mention one, Representative Matt Gaetz. He shows up at the Iowa State Fair. So a very banal, all-American occasion. Everyone's eating their corn dogs, the Trump rally. And he says only force can bring change to corrupt Washington, D.C. That, to somebody who studies fascism, is a fascist statement. Elections are not how we get change in America. It's force. That's violence. So, as Jack said, it's not just Trump. He has a whole array of helpers and institutions, but it's paying off, as we see in the polls, where Americans will say, yes, perhaps violence will be necessary.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the dehumanization of migrants. It's, of course, he dehumanizes all his enemies. He refers now to the left as vermin, as communists, as the enemy within, which, again, goes back to Pinochet and other such dictators who have primed a population for violence. Jack, back in 2020, it was mainly Trump. As Ruth points out, and as you've pointed out, he now has a whole coterie of people. He has your Carrie Lakes, you have your Matt Gaetzes, you have Kash Patel, Steve Bannon, all saying this stuff. The drumbeat of we need force, these people are liars, they're communists, we need to destroy them. And I just wonder, you touched on it earlier, but just spell it out for us. January 6th was a riot at the Capitol, best case scenario, domestic terrorism and insurgency, according to the FBI and others, worst case scenario, however you want to define it, an insurrection. But it was at the Capitol, and as you say, it was a bunch of people. It could have been bigger. What does it look like in January 2025 if Trump loses again? This time, they're even more pissed. They're even more angry. They've been stewing in the conspiracy fever lands, the fever swamps online for many more years. They're absolutely convinced that this has been stolen from them twice. They're heavily armed. They're way more coordinated. They've now got the world's richest man controlling the most powerful social media site on their side. What does the violence, chaos look like in January 2025, I wonder?
Well, it looks like civil war, if it comes to that. Now, Trump has been telling his supporters since his nomination that he won last time, they were cheated, and that the Democrats are preparing to cheat again. He's spreading the same stories about immigrants are going to be used to, manage the vote. He says, I have proof of fraud that occurred last time, and I know it's happening again. And he's saying that Democrats are so awful, so dangerous for the country, so destructive of the American fabric, that the only way they could possibly win would be by cheating. So he's priming his supporters to fight for him if he loses. I think the struggles will be larger. We may see the National Guard in larger numbers coming out, and we'll see Americans fighting and perhaps shooting each other in the streets in order to basically help Donald Trump achieve his personal goals at the expense of the country.
Yes, indeed. What a personality cult that has become. Ruth, there is this sense, and correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of people ask me about violence, and I say what Jack just said, that if they lose, they're going to be super violent. It's going to be January 6th on steroids. But if they win, there's also the prospect of violence, because as you pointed out, he's primed his people to be ready for whatever he does to whatever enemy group, migrants, the left. You know, we've heard reports. We've seen Project 2025. We've heard reports in the Times and the Post that they plan to invoke the Insurrection Act, put the military on the streets. There's not going to be a woman's march of the kind we saw in January 2017, is there? Because this time round, he's just going to put the military out to crack down. Or am I wrong?
I believe there could still be mass protest. It's just that if he's done his job correctly and he's convinced enough people who are part of the armed bodies of our nation to go along with him, then the response would be very different. But I always say never underestimate the American people, and we've seen with the total outflow of joy and hope and enthusiasm and mobilization for Kamala Harris that I don't think those people are just going to go back in their homes and resign themselves to having their rights taken away. So we'll have to see about that.
I'm a bit more,
but it's a daunting situation, certainly, and this is part of what authoritarians do. They create a sense of chaos and uncertainty and fear and dread. Dread is a good word. And they hope that people will actually not vote at all, be too frightened
yes,
to participate further in the political process or in civil society.
Ruth, as an immigrant to this great country, I'm a little bit more cynical about the American people on this issue than you are. Where I go, I even meet leftists and liberals who are super complacent about the threat from Trump. The number of people I meet, friends, family, quote-unquote normies out there who don't follow the news closely, who don't read strongmen or attend your classes at George Mason or NYU. I wish they did. And they say stuff like, oh, well, it can't happen here. Oh, that's in other countries. Or, the institutions will hold. They held last time round, he couldn't do it. Last time round, he was stopped by the Supreme Court. This time round, he will be too. There's a real level of complacency, is there not? It can happen here.
Yeah, and of course, that's the commonality of the cases I studied for my book, that people were always in denial. They thought it couldn't happen here. From the Germans who, they were one of the most advanced societies in the world in 1920s, early 30s Germany for science, graphic design, medicine, technology, and they never thought that this would happen. But also where there are coups. And the example that always stays with me is the Christian Democrats, who were like the conservative elites. They had supported the coup when it happened because they didn't like the left. But the head of the Christian Democrats actually thought that Pinochet was going to, restore order. That's always the phrase. And then return power to civilians and have democracy back. And of course, that's completely naive. And they had a 17-year dictatorship instead. So that is true, that there's always this mix of denial in complacency, and authoritarians specialize in doing the unthinkable and bringing the unthinkable to your country.
Jack, denial, complacency, naivete. Is that fair?
There's a lot of that. I do trust the American people if they have a chance to understand what's at stake. We've seen people line up behind Kamala Harris to a surprising degree. Yep. She offers something fresh and hopeful, and that's what people want. They want something hopeful. There's been huge discouragement. I mean, there's been no doubt that we've seen the rich get richer, and a lot of average Americans feel like they've been left behind. They want a change, and Donald Trump offers them one kind of change. It's a change with retribution and violence.
Burn it all down.
And that's appealing, but I think Americans are likely to turn away. My fear is that not only will there be violence if Trump loses, but if he should win a narrow election, and then try to implement extreme policies. Say he goes along with a national abortion ban, or say he decides to really crack down on protests for racial justice. That will provoke larger protests, yep. And then we'll have to see where that goes. But there's danger either way because the ground is so divided.
So on the ground being divided, let's take a step back.
Yeah.
Let's put Trump to one side. This stuff and your research on this stuff predates Trump, right?
Correct.
The underlying tensions, the divisions in American society, the grievances. A lot of people argued in 2016, was this racial resentment or was this economic insecurity? And obviously there's elements of both. Right. I tend to be of the school of thought that a lot of this is about race, but I know a lot of people like Bernie Sanders would say, actually, it's the left behind. Where do you stand on that when it comes to racial and economic inequality and what's driving the actual ground level in places like Pennsylvania or Michigan or wherever it is?
There are too many things to count.
Okay.
There are Christians who feel the country is no longer a Christian majority.
Yep.
There are minorities who feel that their status is risked by too many immigrants coming in and pushing them aside.
Yep.
Not only Native Americans, but many recent immigrants feel
Yes.
the same way. There are people who worry that uncontrolled immigration is going to change America and they'll do anything to stop it. And there are people who feel economically they're not getting their fair chance, that the Democrats are doing too much for other groups. I don't think it's all true, but there's often a kernel of truth to some of these beliefs that festers when they are reinforced with a message of resentment from politicians. Now, I think one other thing that really worries me is in 2016, the guardrails were in place to a greater degree. We had political elites who would speak out against violence. We had justices at the Supreme Court and other federal courts who were committed to preserving an objective support for the Constitution. Those things have been peeled away in the last 8 years. We now can't really trust the courts. They seem much more partisan.
Well, they've given him immunity in advance.
Indeed. And there are an array of political leaders in the Republican Party who have cast everything aside to back even the most extreme claims that Trump has made. So with politicians en masse pushing violence and the courts not standing up for equal application of the law. Indeed, the argument that all the courts are just weaponizing justice, so why not use violence to achieve justice ourselves? Things are really at greater risk.
Ruth, you mentioned earlier a coup, right? And I know I believe you're actually teaching a class on coups at NYU. Let me ask you this. When J.D. Vance, as he did, the running mate for Donald Trump, goes on the All In podcast, as he did this week with the right-wing tech bros, and he's asked straight up, would he have done what Mike Pence did? Would he have certified the vote? And he says, no, I wouldn't have. I'd have called for alternate slates of electors, which the vice president has no power, no role in the Constitution to do. That is a coup, is it not? And should we not call it that? Should our quote-unquote neutral media not call a spade and say, that's a coup?
I think so, and I called it a coup in a piece I wrote on January 6th for CNN Opinion, and I have not wavered since. And you know, this is one of these things that can't happen here. We don't have coups, and the other thing is that today coups can be, you know, they're not about tanks in the street necessarily.
Yes.
They can be something that you always have to prepare the ground for a coup, not just with elite conspiracies. And here, you know, the DOJ did not cast a wide net, as they did in Brazil after Bolsonaro's January 8th, 2023 attempted coup, where they cast a very wide net. They immediately went for the civilian enablers, the funders of the thugs who came. We didn't do that here. And also Bolsonaro, most importantly, this is the decapitation strategy, figuratively. Bolsonaro was convicted for election fraud and, very importantly, banned from politics for 7 years. We didn't do any of that. So here we are with the coup leader, the coup instigator, who is, you know, the front runner for the presidency. So all the more reason to help people understand that the array of people who prepare coups nowadays within the institutions and how they ally with the thugs, the foot soldiers, and all the phases of coups that certainly unfolded here.
Last question to you, Jack Goldstone. In terms of kind of not just the enablers, but allowing Trump to then still be the candidate now. That's a failure, many would argue, of the Democratic Party and the Biden administration. There's always this kind of projection from the Republicans. They're weaponizing the government. They're going after our guy. And I always look at that and say, if only. It's the exact opposite. Merrick Garland dragged his heels, in my view. Joe Biden was very late to this argument about democracy and fascism. As someone who studied this stuff for years, I'm sure interacted with people on the Hill in the executive branch. Were the people in power, were Democrats, were the liberal media, were they late to this in identifying the very real threat, which you say, of civil war?
not just Democrats are responsible. Congress had an opportunity to render Donald Trump unable to run for office again if they had convicted him for the charge of bringing violence against Congress. They didn't do so. They came close, but they couldn't quite get the two-thirds.
Couldn't get enough Republican senators.
Couldn't get enough Republicans. After that, I agree that the Democratic Department of Justice has been very slow in bringing charges for election violence. I think we need to remember, because it's too often forgotten, what happened in January 6th was not just a riot or protest.
Yep.
We've had riots or protests over labor rights, women's rights, Vietnam War. This was an effort to prevent the president-elect from being certified as the next president of the United States. It was an effort to change the course of our democratic government in an undemocratic manner. Every responsible politician should have condemned it, as many did in the days after, but they needed to follow through and show that there were legal consequences. Trump should have been banned. Now, the DOJ wanted not to be too political. They knew they'd be accused of weaponizing, so they hoped that if Donald Trump was defeated, he would fade away. But I think they should not have had that hope. They should have seen
more naivete.
More naivete.
Jack Goldstone, Ruth Ben-Ghiat, a fascinating, if disturbing discussion, but an important discussion. Thank you both for your expertise and analysis.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Did you like this video? Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel and turn on notifications. For exclusive content and to support our independent, unfiltered journalism, head over to zeteo.com. Your support matters.